2 minutes โอเค โอเคครับอาจารย์สมถะ I think we can start now
Right. Okay, right?
yes
Okay. Yes, very good evening, everybody. Sawadee krap and namaskar. So I would welcome all of you. On behalf of the Department of Humanities, I would like to welcome all of our participants, whether from Thailand, from other parts of the world. So today we have the last talk of this series. So the topic that we are going to discuss is sort of a combination of two thoughts, school of thoughts like Buddhism and the Western thoughts of ideas. So basically, I get often asked this question from some of you. Basically, what is this the concept of nomadology? Because some are not bit familiar with the concept. So I'm trying to give you sort of background information, and then I will invite our distinguished speaker to continue our talk. So the nomadology, when you deconstruct this compound word as nomad and ology, that means nomad is a sort of traveling or wanderer, and ology is a subject of study. So when you combine these two words and as a compound, it has a sort of this academic study of wanderer, or sort of the life of wanderer. So now when you have this idea in that way, and also when you study the history of this concept of nomadology, now we can see that there is a sort of it's mostly related to a sort of cultural perspective. As you know, like the people, one of the member of a tribe may travel in seeking of food, water, or even warfare. So that is a sort of the origin or the basic interpretation of nomadology in the Western context. So in other words, we can say they are material seekers. But when you combine this concept, the same concept, into Buddhist thought, it's sort of quite opposite. Because when I see that when you investigate the Buddhist text, there are some group of people in the Buddhist text that we often encounter, like they are called Paribhajaka, Ajivaka, and Achelas. They are basically the monastic, or rather they are looking for spiritual advancement, or they are teaching the good and the moral life throughout their journey. So in other words, we can briefly tell this one as a sort of material seekers versus immaterial or spiritual seekers or preachers. So having said that, I think our distinguished scholar will illuminate on this very subject. So I am going to take this opportunity to invite our distinguished scholar, Assistant Professor Avishek Ray. He is from the Faculty of, he's from Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, National Institute of Technology, Silchar. And he did his PhD from Canada, Trent University in 2014. Of course, when I see his CV, I can see there are so many publications in terms of countless number of conference papers. So without further ado, I would like to invite our distinguished speaker, Assistant Professor Avishek, to illuminate on this subject. And Professor Avishek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ajahn Samantha. Thank you, the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, Mahidol University. It's always a pleasure. I have been there twice, once physically and this time virtually. So thanks to the faculty for organizing the talk. And as Ajahn Samantha said, this is the last in the series of like a 3-lecture series. So this brings to, the concluding session of the 3 lectures. So it has been a very enriching experience to engage with all of you for the last 2 events. And I really look forward to discussing things with you today and, in the future course of events. So it's unusually early here, like 6:30 in the morning. So if I am not very coherent, the fault is not mine, but please do not hesitate to stop me and ask things if you think I'm not being very clear or coherent. So yeah, so with that, I'll quickly begin by, introducing the concept of nomadology. Of course, Dr. Rajapaksha has made it somewhat easier for me as he has introduced a bit of the concept, but then I'll quickly talk about it in the context of the West, in the context of Western continental philosophy, and I'll look into how this idea ran through, the cultural current in South Asia. So I'm doing what I'm doing in today's talk is what may loosely be called a prehistory. I'll give you the idea of the concept as it is invoked by modern continental philosophers, and then I'll go back in time and I'll look how manifestations of this concept was kind of pre-existent in the Indian thought, and how certain Western thinkers and intellectuals would ascribe it to what they understood as the Indian brand of Buddhism. So when I say Indian brand of Buddhism, this is not my coinage, and it is also arguable and contentious if there's anything can be called as like Indian Buddhism, but this is a terminology that some of the key figures that I'm going to discuss in today's talk, they call it Indian Buddhism. So there are 2 factors that I'm kind of trying to invoke here. One is India. And when I say India, let me be clear, this has got no, connection with the modern day imagination of India as a nation state after 1947, the kind of political map that you see on the map. So this is not this India I'm talking about. I'm talking about what may be loosely be called South Asia in general. And I'm talking about pre-modern India. And I cannot give you a map because the map was evolving at that point of time, depending on, the kingdom, the which king, and so on and so forth. It was an evolving map at that point of time. So when I say India throughout today's talk, in the remotest sense of imagination, I'm not referring to a particular geopolitical territory in the map. I'm talking about a certain sensibility of thinking, and this has got to do with a better expression would be, Indic culture, or South Asian. South Asia, in fact, is a very modern, coinage in the academy. In the academia, people started studying South Asian studies only in the 1950s and 60s, especially, to be precise, after the World War and things like that. So, I mean, these are very contentious, problematic terminologies, but I mean, for lack of a better expression, I'll use these expressions nevertheless, but let me tell you that these expressions come with a caveat. So when I say India, it's not the modern day map. When I say South Asia, it's not a geopolitical territory. So I'm talking in the course of the talk, when I uttered these expressions, I'm trying to invoke a kind of a Indic sensibility, which is rooted in its Sanskritic past. So it has got more to do with a sensibility than a geographical territory. So that's point number one. So I'll now quickly talk about what nomadology is, and thanks to Ajahn Samantha, he has done a quick recap or a quick summary of the concept. And those of you who are interested, I mean, I'll just name a couple of Western theorists who elaborated this concept in the Western thought. The most prominent being Deleuze and Guattari. They have a whole book on nomadology, the War Machine, and then you have Rosi Braidotti. I think she's Italian English scholar, Rosi Braidotti, and of course Michel Disarto and Edward Said. So these are the four theorists that I find mostly instrumental in popularizing the concept of nomadology. And what this means is it refers to a kind of non-conformity, non-linearity, and non-instrumentality, in the sense that when I say non-conformity, it's kind of a political subjectivity that doesn't conform to dominant expressions of power. So when you are resisting to statist powers, when you are resisting to certain authoritarian diktats, so that's a kind of a non-conforming subjectivity. It's a dissident kind of subjectivity that is referred to as nomadology. But one may ask that why nomad? Like, why is resistance linked to the idea of nomad? As you understand, the English word nomad refers to a certain kind of traveling. So if we refer to Deleuze and Guattari in particular, this whole idea of the dissident or the resisting subjectivity comes from what Deleuze calls like non-territorialization. So you are not bound to a territory. And do not take me literally here. Again, territoriality doesn't mean, like a geopolitical territory as such. It is, so for example, if you are not stuck to one particular style of thinking, for example, I mean, it's a very common place to ask nowadays, what is your expertise? What is your field? So, for example, a very interdisciplinary scholar who is not stuck to a single field, for example, would be an example of a nomad in the Deleuzian term. So, when I say nomad, or when Deleuze says nomad, I mean, do not take it literally in the sense like it's a vagabond or a wanderer who is wandering in the street. Of course, that might be true. But what I'm trying to insist here is nomad has a wider context, and a nomad in the Deleuzian imagination, you can also think of the nomad to not having traveled at all. So in other words, what I'm suggesting, it has got less to do with physical travels, but more to do with the kind of a subjectivity, more to do with the kind of cultural ethos that you represent. And this ethos has got to do with, non-conformity. You do not conform to official state diktats of power, official authoritarianism, and also, in one word, if I were to summarize it, let's call it in Foucauldian terms, it's normativity. So what is normal, you do not conform to it. So that is basically being a nomad. So if it is uh, whatever that is normal, you do not conform to it, you question it, you resist it, and in doing so, you are illustrating a kind of a dissident political subjectivity. So this is basically Deleuze and Rosie Braidotti and a number of other thinkers who have, dealt with nomadology in detail. So I've quickly recapped that for you. But my intervention here is, so I marry the idea of wandering, and those of you who were there in my very first talk, I shared the link with my link of my recently published book. The book is called, I'll quickly share it in the chat box again, so that give me one moment. This is here. I'll share it with, sorry for the self promotion, but I mean, in this book, I talk about vagabonds in the South Asian imagination, because also here I argue that vagabonds also illustrate, I mean, especially people who self-profess as vagabonds, people who refer to themselves as vagabonds, those kind of travelers, they illustrate a kind of subjectivity which is similar to what Deleuze refers to as nomadology. And my intervention here is I look into physical acts of wandering, like people who literally travel, people who literally wander, as in itinerants in particular, and I talk discuss about how their traveling can be read as a form of nomadology. In other words, how people travel in order to be able to illustrate the kind of subjectivity that I referred to. So their traveling or their wandering becomes a badge of their identity, non-conforming identity, that they resist statist powers. What they do is they travel to express this resistance. So they travel to resist. So the intent to travel comes from their will to resist. Are you with me so far? Like, did it make sense? So there's a bunch of travelers that is my argument. There's a bunch of travelers who travel in order to illustrate a certain kind of politically dissident, radical subjectivity. So that is my point. And I'm looking into the Buddhist traces, and Ajahn Samantha has correctly pointed out, it is a very long Buddhist monastic tradition where the Buddha suggested his disciples, and if you take his advice to its literal core, and the Buddha actually asked his disciples not to stay at one place more than 3 months, and that too is permissible during the rainy season. Otherwise, you have to always wander. So that is the basic Buddhist tenet. So what I'm doing in today's talk is to find Buddhist traces of this kind of a political subjectivity. And in doing so, I'll also do one thing, namely, I'll point the debates between the Buddhist scholars versus the Vedic scholars. Because if you remember, in the Vedic order, in the Hindu Vedic tradition, there was also a monastic tradition, also a tradition of renunciation. If you, those who are familiar into the Hindu way of being, there was this, fourfold stages of life, where you study when you are young, and then you into the household when you are in middle ages, and then you renounce and go to the forests, and then like the garhastha, bantrastha, sannyas, and all those four stages that come with the Vedic thought. So in other words, in the Vedic school, there was also a very predominant kind of wandering practice that has got to do with the tradition of wandering and renunciation. So the Buddhist scholars had actually they had a debate with the Vedic scholars, and the whole intricacy of the debate was, focused on what is the ideal form of wandering and how you are supposed to travel. So both schools traveled in their own way, but they had very different takes on the ideal imagination of travel. So that's basically what I'm going to do in today's talk. And my argument here is that although if I were to sum it, what I'm trying to argue here is, although this is a fairly nomadology is a fairly recent concept that has been formulated by Deleuze and Guattari first in their book. I think it came out in 1980s, early 80s, 84, 85. The book Nomadology, The War Machine, was published in the 1980s. So this is a fairly recent concept in the Western continental philosophical thought. Yet, and this is my argument, yet nomadology as a radical practice, as symbolic of political dissidence and ethical responsibility towards the other, and the figure of the nomad as the prototype of non-conformist affective subject. I call it affective subject because you tend to extend an affection toward the other and the world around you, rather than be yourself a self-centered person as we imagine under the capitalist diktat. On contrary to that, the affective subject is someone who feels herself to be as a part of the larger world. So very much, part of the Buddhist tradition. So the figure of the nomad as a prototype of the nonconformist affective subject have perpetually exist in the Indian cultural repertoire. Again, Indian is not India of today. India is kind of an Indic sensibility. So in the modern perception of the nomad, it is pitted against an overtly instrumental understanding of space, modern techniques of demographic control. So when I refer to modern techniques of space, I refer to as the massive sedentarization programs. And if you refer to, and I think I referred to this guy, I'll just again type it out in the chat box if you are interested. James Scott, he has this wonderful book called Seeing Like a State. Here you go. So James Scott has this wonderful book called Seeing Like a State, and it's a very interesting book in the sense he talks about how state wants to see its subjects. So that is his point in the book, and he has a very interesting point relevant to today's discussion, and he talks about the sedentarization programs, how states, I mean, it's not about what Indian state or the Thai state, it's about like states in general. States in general wants its population to be sedentary, not nomad or not mobile. Because if people are mobile, and I'm sure this would be the case if I were to invoke certain Thai examples, I'm sure there are Thai tribes in northern Thailand maybe who are not completely domesticated or completely settled. So these are mobile people. Imagine the sea gypsies, like people who stay in the, they don't have a permanent address, and that is their way of life. And in India, there are a bunch of, tribal people, especially in the part of India where I come from, Northeast. People do, I don't know if you know, the jhum cultivation. They burn, they cultivate their crops in one season, and once they reap the crop after the cultivating season, they burn the stubs and the field, and they move on to a certain other place. And I mean, this has got to do with a certain kind of a migratory culture where they are never stuck at one place. So that is their way of life. So I mean, there are several such traditions across the world. Look at the Romani people or the Gypsies in Europe. They are never stuck at one place. Look at the Jews in Europe, although they now have a state, Israel, and all the political caveat now going on, Israel-Palestine thing and all of that. But then there are, with these examples, what I'm trying to suggest is there's a bunch of people, and this is not, connected to one nation or the other nation. It's a global phenomena where there are certain people who do not just like to stay put at one place. They just travel for the love of it, and because that is their way of life. So the thing is, James Scott in his book argues that the state is unhappy with these people precisely because it's very difficult to rule them. In order to be able to better rule, and if I were to borrow a Foucauldian terminology here, Foucault calls this governmentality, as in the art and technique of governing, the intent of governing, how states govern people. It becomes difficult when you have a mobile population because you cannot make sense of them. So what states do, and this is James Scott's argument, I'm drawing on James Scott here. James Scott says states, no matter which part of the world it is, all states, what they do is to try to sedentarize people, because one form of governmentality argues that the better you are able to know your population, the better will you be able to rule them. So in order for able to be better ruling a population, the idea is you have to know them in detail to the core. Whatever details you need to gather, you need to know it. So that is James Scott's argument, and this is precisely why states want to they domesticate mobile populations. They do not like a population that are mobile. They want to sedentarize them. So this is what I refer when I talk about the modern techniques of space, and this is pretty much 18th 19th century phenomena with very modern ideas of space and state and political economy and that kind of thing. The whole idea of the territorial imagination of a state. This is basically in the case of India, it's a very colonial thing. Like the British came in and they put a territory and they marked it on the map. Look, this is India. But if you go back to the pre-modern times, as in pre-British times, the Indian map was changing, let's say, every 20 years, depending on which king was in power, who he conquered, and who he went to war against, and so on and so forth. So the whole idea of a territorial imagination of a state, like a state is married to a territory. Like if we, Italy, Germany, India, Thailand, these are all pieces of territory on the map. And these are like very, how do I put it? Like these are very uh, mm, 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 explicitly defined. And nations go to war if the India-China conflict, imagine, all the time. So it's our tiny piece of land where India says China has intruded upon, and the vice versa, China says India has intruded upon. So people go to war. I mean, nations go to war over a tiny piece of territory, and that's precisely because nations nowadays, after 18th 19th century, is imagined as a perfectly mappable piece of territory. So this wasn't the case of the time that I'm talking to, which is the pre-modern times. Like people didn't care much about territory and nation. I mean, the concept of the nation state, forget about territoriality, territorial imagination of state. People didn't care about nations. There was no concept of nation state as such. There were only, political kingdoms and territories and things like that. And if people were not caring about territories, it was a world where travel and being a nomad in that kind of a worldview was easier compared to the James Scott kind of world where the state forces you to be, it's a crime in most states, in India at least, and I'm sure that would be the case in Thailand too. If you do not have an address, it's a legal crime. So, I mean, you might not have constitutionally violated something else, but I mean, just not having an address, a fixed address, a permanent address is a crime in India. And that is the case in many other states across the world. So this is precisely the reason. So if you do not have an address, the state doesn't know who you are, where you come from, where you go, and that makes it difficult to rule a certain population. Uh, so these nomads are particularly, to bring the long story short, so these nomads are particularly not, liked by the state. So what I'm arguing here is, in India, the epochal recursivity in the reappropriation of the discursive trope of itinerancy. I'll explain all of these. Do not worry about the very wordy sentence here. Is that the discursive trope of itinerancy as a rhetoric of resistance. This is what I refer to as this: when you travel, and that becomes a symbol of resistance. So that is what I refer to as the trope of itinerancy as a rhetoric of resistance. And if you recall, this trope was used by the Buddhists, Jains, against the Vedic hegemony in the ancient times. And these are all, examples of very explicit political resistances. So the Buddhist and Jains, they traveled as resistance to the Vedic hegemony in the ancient times. The Bhakta and Sufi, these are medieval saints, and they were also, for those of you who are not aware, and I'm sure there are people in the religious studies program who might also be actually aware, that Bhakti and Sufi were a movement in medieval India. Bhakti branched out from the Hindu thought, and Sufi more or less from the Islamic thought. And these were people, these were saints who were, mm, very troubled by the kind of authoritarianism that these two schools of thought, as in Hinduism and Islam, they exercised. They were very authoritarian, and these schools branched out with a more kind of a liberal worldview. So they got away with the ritualistic tradition. So the Vedic tradition was very ritualistic. If you look into the Vedas, it always talks about you have to perform this, you have to do this, if you have done this, you have to do that. So it's kind of a like if this then that kind of a text. So if you do this, you have to do, if you want to get a son, you have to perform this, if you want to have this kind of a life, you have to perform this, that kind of a text. So they were, so same in the case of Islam, medieval Islam, at least in the case of India, if you look into it, it's very ritualistically oriented. So both the Sufis and Bhakta sent, they branched out from the Hindu slash Islamic tradition, and they were more liberal, and they kind of personalized their gods, and they said that gods are also persons, and they do not want rituals from us, but they want, friendship, love, and affection. So if you look into some of these Bhakti and Sufi poetries, they are also to a great extent very sexualized. So also God, in some sense, also portrayed as a, very personalized human being. So the God is humanized and also portrayed as a very sexual being, which was also a taboo in medieval India. So there were a bunch of Bhakti and Sufi poets who actually they were tried by the kingly courts because they had sexualized the god. So you can also, I mean, on a side note, you can also look into this as a case of, medieval ban, and cases of obscenity, and so on and so forth. So the Bhaktis and Sufis, they did this in the medieval times, and most of these Bhakti Sufi figures, and I'm not going to bore you with the names of these. I'm happy to share with you, and there's a number of figures actually over the course of 500 years. I can name, there are a number of figures who were actually great travelers. They traveled across the entire breadth of India, because they just loved to. I mean, they were, as I said, they were not after rituals, because in the Vedic tradition there was also this tradition of pilgrimage. So you have to make your journey to this, that, and the other sites of religious pilgrimage. So that wasn't the case for the Bhakti and Sufi person. They traveled because they just wanted to travel. So this was not religious pursuits as such. They wanted to travel, as I said, because they just wanted to travel. So these people were great travelers, and they were also against, statist authoritarianism in the medieval times. So I give you two examples here: the Buddhist gens in the ancient times, the Bhakti and the Sufi figures in the medieval times, and by certain nationalist ideologues. They wandered against the modernist British tendency to criminalize mobility. So yeah, so there was again a bunch of I'm not going to name them because that will make a detour in the context of today's discussion. So there were again a bunch of nationalist leaders. I mean, Gandhi, for example. I'm sure that all of you have heard about Mohandas Gandhi, the great nationalist, and I could also name a bunch of other people who traveled precisely because the British government asked them not to travel. So this, the defiant kid, there's a defiant child in our, we always come across this defiant child. The child does exactly what the parents ask her not to do. So that kind of a sentiment when the British wanted people to remain stuck and not travel. There were a bunch of these nationalist people who wanted to travel because that was a slap on the colonial government. They wanted to show, look, I'm doing what you are asking me not to do. So again, this kind of a very defiant feeling. So if you, so I've given you three examples from three ages actually: Buddhist gens in the Vedic times, ancient times, the Bhakti Sufi in the medieval times, and certain nationalist people in the modern times. So these examples point to the long-standing Indian tradition of nomads trying to achieve alternate utopia. So the colonial tendency to criminalize itinerancy, in fact, started with the deployment of the Criminal Tribes Act 1871. And if I did talk about this a bit in my book, so this was the first legal intervention, actually, 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. And very interestingly, the British, as you know, I mean, being the colonizers, they were very cunning and very clever in the sense that they deployed this Criminal Tribes Act in 1871, and they connected criminality with traveling. I mean, of course, tourism was an exception because that was linked to ideas of capitalism, and that was the kind of travel that the state would encourage you to do. Even in today's world, like, the state would encourage you to undertake a certain kind of traveling, but discourage you to travel the vagabond way. So this was also prevalent, and the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act was exactly a prelude to this mentality, because in 1871 the British came in and first said, look, if you do not have an address, if you are incessantly mobile, and if you are a nomad, and if you are a vagabond, the likeliness is that you are a criminal. So they started fingerprinting them, and most of us do not know, and it is hard to believe now, the technique of fingerprinting actually started first in India. Historically speaking, the British first started the technique of fingerprinting in India. So that was because there was these nomads and wandering people who the British couldn't keep track of, and they found a smart way to keep track of them in the way what James Scott has referred to as seeing like a state. So that's precisely how state wants to see its population. So what they did is to, if you are, imagine if you are a part of the a wandering tribe in 1960s, I'm sorry, 1860s in India. If you are part of the wandering community, the British would say, look, if you are wandering, we think you are a criminal. So you are likely to be a more criminal. So they didn't need any evidence, nothing. So this act basically rounded up people who were mobile and said, if you are traveling in the inappropriate way, we take you to be a criminal. We don't know. We don't need any evidence. If you're traveling in the nomad style, if you're wandering in a vagabondly way, we take you to be a criminal. And what we do is to take your fingerprints, and so it's easier to track you and things like that. So this is what the Act 1871 Act said. So this actually outrightly labeled backward itinerant communities as inherently criminal. So that's what the Act did. So since then, a series of vagrancy acts were legislated until the 1940s. So 1871 to 1940, there were at least 50 different vagrancy acts put in place in different parts of India, all wanting to restrict mobility in certain ways. So they wanted to restrict people to travel. Of course, like not travel in general. I'm stressing this. They wanted to stop traveling the way they discouraged a certain kind of traveling. So this is what I associate with nomadology. So I want to be very clear here, and I insist that you also make this distinction. So traveling in general was not forbidden. It was a particular kind of traveling that the British thought is dangerous for the art of statecraft and governmentality, and that is what I refer to as nomadology. So here I aim to situate the nomad as a distinct ontological category, and this is very different here. And actually, this is the subject of the larger book that I wrote. So I aim to situate the nomad. So the nomad is just not any random traveler, and I want you also to be able to make this distinction. So the nomad is just not any random traveler. So the nomad is a distinct ontological category, different from the traveler, migrant, and refugee. And how is it different? Nomadology is not strictly a function of practices of traveling per se, and this is precisely what I began today's discussion with. So I traveled last week, I traveled from India to the US, but I'm not a nomad because I traveled in the way the state wanted me to travel. I have an address back in India. I have an address, a fixed address now in the US. I bought a flight ticket. I have passport, visas, and every legal protocols that the state wants me to meet. I've met everything. So I'm not a nomad, although I have traveled, intercontinentally across, several thousands of miles. Like I made a great deal of travel, but I'm not a nomad. So I'm talking about the nomad who might not have undertaken any travel, but it's a kind of a sensibility, it's a kind of a political subjectivity. So that's why I say nomadology is not strictly a function of practices of traveling per se, or about the coordinates of physical mobility. It rather functions as a metaphor of a certain nomadic model of social organization. What I refer to as the nomadic model of social organization is at odds with the kind of the statist interventions, that statist authoritarianism that I just talked about. So it rather functions as a metaphor of a certain nomadic model of social organization in contrast to the static sedentary model. So it is unlike the static sedentary model. So nomad is an itinerant subject, nevertheless, but her mobility is politically charged and has a semiotic significance, in the sense that if you see a homeless person on the street who doesn't have an address, she is not a nomad because she doesn't necessarily illustrate the kind of subjectivity that I'm talking about. So I want you to make this distinction between the nomad, traveler, migrant, refugee, homeless, and so on and so forth. So you might have a number of English words, or I'm sure there are other words in other languages that refer to certain kind of wandering or mobile subjects. But nomadology, in its very core distilled essence, illustrates a kind of a certain political subjectivity. So I'll stop here with my discussion on, nomadology here, and I'll get into the India and the Buddhist part here. So the hypothesis here concerning the pre-existence of nomadology in India does not, however, assume nomadology as an ahistorical category, in the sense that, it's already there. So I'm not making that kind of an argument, nor does it intend to essentialize the concept of India. This I mentioned already, like the concept of India also changes over time, not as a political territory, but the whole idea of the sensibility, the last threads. So on the contrary, what I'm trying to do is like the originary trying to put my fingers on this originary moment of friction between nomadology and statist authority in the context of pre-modern India. So what I refer to as the nomadic subjectivity, its core is the resistance, is the defiance, is the kind of political subjectivity. So I'm trying to locate in pre-modern India where it started, like this whole friction between like the nomadic subjectivity and the statist authoritarianism. So these are at odds. This doesn't go along together. So this is what I refer to as the friction. So when I refer to as what I refer to as the pre-existence of nomadology in the Indian thought, I'm trying to uh, pinpoint where exactly in pre-modern India this friction between the state and nomads started. So that is what I'm more interested in. So with that, I'll come to the whole idea of legislating mobility. So I gave you a classic example in colonial times, the 1871 Criminal Tribes Act. So if we go back in history, and this is what I refer to as an exercise in prehistory, what I'm trying to do in this section of the talk, and this will be the concluding section. I'll try to point where in pre-modern India exactly this whole idea of legislating mobility start. What I refer to as legislating, I think it should be clear by now. So you bring into laws, regulations, and diktats, and you try to define out of a sense of cultural polarity, you try to assess which mobility is good and which mobility is bad. So this is what I refer to as legislating mobility. So you bring the discourse of law into place. And of course, in the medieval times, the law means medieval and ancient times, in the Vedic times, in the Buddhist past, of course, legislating refers to as scriptural tradition. So you can find sources in the scriptures where people actually debate about whether I should be mobile, whether mobility is a good thing. If so, what kind of mobility is encouraged? What kind of mobility is discouraged? So you have rules and regulations and guidelines oriented toward understanding of or assessing the value of wandering, if I may put it that way. So you bring regulations into place and you try to assess the value of wandering. So this is what I refer to as legislating mobility. So in the concluding section of the talk, I'm more interested in looking at when did this tradition of legislating first start in pre-modern India. Uh, what is of concern here is how does the pre-modern trajectory of nomad, both as a concept and a figure in the context of India, function as a prehistory of the trope of nomadology that I just referred to? How does the obtrusive Indianization of the trope of nomadology, I call this Indianization because there's a number of scholars, I do not have time to get into this today, but again, in the book and a couple of other articles I have published, I talk about how certain Western figures, most prominently the Bits, like Jack Kerouac and, Allen Ginsberg and all of that, like American avant-garde modernists, they look back to India as a site of nomadology. They look back to India as a site. And if you read personal letters of Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg in particular. These were key Beats figure, part of the Beats movement. They always talk about India to be their source of intellectual stimuli, in India to be their inspiration. Because if you remember, all of these Beats figure, they were wandering across the length and breadth of America. So if you look into their personal writings, diaries and letters, they always invoke India to be their inspiration. So that's why I refer to this as obtrusive Indianization of the trope, because there's a number of itinerants or nomads, if we may call them, they cited India as their inspiration. So what rendered the trope discursively meaningful when and where it was reappropriated? How has the residual in the trope as a conduit for political radicalism become emergent in certain times. So in other words, to bring again the long story short, cutting the long story short, I'm more interested in how certain, scriptures, they kind of, debated and wanted to assess the worth of wandering. So I'll quickly give you a tour, maybe a very, because I don't have much time, I'll quickly give you a tour of the Vedic versus Buddhist debate, and I'll stop here so that you can understand, the Buddhist connection, and then maybe in the discussion session we can tease that out. So if the closest approximation of the word nomad in pre-modern India, if you see, it's the, I refer to this, the figure of the renunciant. So it's there in the Vedic tradition, it's there in the Vedic school. So after you, if you look into the classic Vedic scriptures, including Manusmriti and Yajnavalkya and all of that. So these are Hindu scriptures. You do not have to know the names, but these are again, like, classic Hindu scriptures. And if you look into, there's this stages of life, and you have to study when you are young. I mean, very much the kind of life that we are now, oriented towards. You study when you are young. In the Middle Ages, you have a family, what they refer to as the Garhastha. And in the third stage is renunciation. You leave your family and you practice some kind of, renunciation. And if you have more spiritual quest, and if you are equipped, and if you are intellectually equipped, you would in the fourth stage. And the fourth stage is not for everyone. There are reservations, and there are again scriptural guidelines, like who would undergo the fourth stage. And of course there are casteist implications. If you are not a Brahmin, in some scriptures you cannot actually, undertake sannyas. So sannyas is the ultimate spiritual quest, where you, it's a renunciation at the ultimate level. So of course in the third stage you renounce, but in the fourth stage it's a more elevated form of renunciation. And actually you go to the forests and you live like a hermit. So you completely cut off your ties with the family and the world, and you live like a hermit in the forest toward your spiritual quest. So this was mostly the script, the Hindu scriptures, very briefly put. I'm not going into the details, so I have the names of scriptures here with the particular shlokas and the number of the shlokas and number of the couplets, where exactly what they talk about. There's a Manusmriti and Vishnusmriti and Bodhayana and Yajnavalkya, all four of these classic scriptures, but I'm not going into this. But what I'm interested to point to you is this very interesting point that Patrick Olivelle, he's a scholar of Hindu scriptures and ancient Indian thought. So he makes this interesting point, and I find this very instrumental in the kind of like in the context of today's talk and also the book project. Patrick Olivelle points that there's a dichotomy in the Indian structure of feeling towards renunciation, in the sense that the classic scriptures that dated back from the earlier times, and of course when I refer to Hindu, I mean, this doesn't requires mention, but just to be clear, like when I refer to as Hindu scriptures, I mean, it's not like unlike the other modern religions. It's not a a classic cult book like the Bible or the Quran. So the Hindu scriptures, it's all scattered in all different places. And the scriptural texts, even the four that I mentioned, were composed across several hundreds, if not thousands of years. So these were mostly texts in the oral traditions, and they were interpolated and extrapolated, and like these texts were also evolving. So it's not like a Bible or a Quran, like you have a text cover to cover. It's not like that. So these texts were also, evolving, and there's no clear body to the text. It's not a cover to cover text. Do not imagine this text to be like a book that you can read from cover to cover. So these texts, precisely because they evolved over time, few hundreds, if not thousands of years, So what Patrick Olivelle notes here is the Dharma Sutras, as in the scriptures that came first, they had a fairly lenient view of nomadology. I mean, it wasn't a concern. So if you want to travel, you travel. If you do not want to travel, you do not travel. I'm not going into the details of the shlokas. I can retrieve that if you have further interests. I can retrieve the shlokas from the scriptures and help you with a more scriptural or a textual understanding. But for the sake of the concept for today's discussion, let me tell you, Patrick Olivelle says that the scriptures that dated earlier in the classic times, and it's very important to note here, early times meaning they were not contesting Buddhism at that point of time. So Buddhism was not in question. So Hinduism as such didn't have a rival to, to play against. So at that point of time, the scriptures were very lenient and liberal. So some scriptures said, and this is the dichotomy that Patrick Olivelle points in his book, he precisely locates that some scripture says, no, being a nomad or itinerant or renunciation, it is good. Some scripture says, no, it is bad. Garhastha, as in the family life, is the of core importance. You should more stick to it, and there should be a reservation. So renunciation is not for everyone. But then there are other scriptures who say, no, Garhastha is also not for everyone. Renunciation is the ultimate goal of life. So there's a contradiction. Let's call it a contradiction. And if you go to the later Dharma Sutras, like Manusmriti, for example, Manusmriti is strictly against renunciation in the sense that it says that you have to do this, that, and the other. You have to pay certain fine. You have to do certain ritual in order for you to be able to renounce, and so on and so forth. So Patrick Olivelle, I find this argument extremely, extremely interesting in the sense that Patrick Olivelle says that when Buddhism was not a rival religion, Hindu scriptures were very lenient. They were contradictory. One is saying it's good, other is saying it is bad. But once Buddhism was in question and there was, collective spirit of, getting into rivalry with Buddhism, because Buddhism was also becoming popular as an emergent religion, they said, like, being nomad is not a very good thing because that became a cultural icon of the Buddhists. So in order to be able to, it's kind of a cultural plurality. If so, no matter value wise whether this is good or bad, I think what you do is a bad. So if you are a vegetarian and I'm a meat eater, I'll say being vegetarianism is a bad thing. And if it is the vice versa, if you eat meat and I'm a vegetarian, I'll say being vegetarian is a good thing and being a meat eater is a bad thing. So that's a very instinctual cultural polarity. You try to view the other culture as bad, no matter what that is. You do not assess the value of it. You do not get into reasoning or rational. Whatever your other rival is doing, that is a bad thing to begin with. So this is, to put very simply and very grossly, this is Patrick Olivelle's point, that since the Buddhists started wandering, the Vedic school started to say, no, wandering is a bad thing. Earlier, they had a contradiction in their own tradition. So this is one point. So I'll not get into these, contextual details here. So these contradictions in essence point to one central enunciative paradox. Because classical Hindu scriptural take on the issue of renunciation was indeed contradictory, the practice of itinerancy in what we may loosely call pre-modern India was simultaneously encouraged and discouraged. Did you get my point? So what I'm trying to say is, if you ask me to give me a scriptural point of view on renunciation or itinerancy, there's no one single point of view that I can retrieve, because the view is contradictory. It is both discouraged and it is encouraged and discouraged. So that is the contradiction. So the categories with which we understand the world are grounded in systems of values and beliefs. I will not get into this. So I have a bit of Foucault here, and which is what I just referred. Like it's about how your visualization of the other, what the other does, is necessarily bad. So that is a value system instinctual to human thought, and that is how we politically ostracize or marginalize the other. So, however, the later Dharma Sutras, as I said, they were kind of tolerant and so on and so forth. So that, yeah, so yes, so I'll quickly now come to the very core of the debate here. So the renouncier, as in the wanderer in the Vedic tradition, would wander in order, and this is the crucial difference with Buddhism. And this is where my intervention is, and I trace this as, you know, the prehistoric moment where the friction between state and native practices of wandering happen, and this has historically got to do with actually the Vedic versus Buddhist debate. So the renouncier in the Vedic tradition would wander in order not to develop any attachment either with the lay community or fellow monks, and this is what we refer to as the fourth stage of the sannyasa. And I said this is not for all, this is the ultimate intellectual or spiritual pursuit. So the idea is, and this is the crucial difference with Buddhism, and I want to underline it, and this will actually, lay clear my talk here today. The Hindu sannyasi, the Vedic sannyasi, he was supposed not to maintain any ties either with his family, the state, or even fellow monks. So he was a solitary monk, as opposed to the Buddhist monks. They often traveled in group. So the renouncier in the Vedic tradition would wander in order not to develop any attachment either with the lay community or fellow monks or sannyasis. So he would be solitary and he would be isolated. One has to be careful in this context to distinguish between the individual renouncer who isolates himself totally. In short, the ideal ascetic, when I say ideal ascetic, it's in the Hindu Vedic imagination, and the one who opts out of the society but joins a group of fellow monastics, like in the case of Buddhism. Most most Buddhists, because the Buddhist monastic tradition, in the Buddhist monastic tradition, they go and they join a group, Sangha, for example. They join a Sangha. So one has to be careful, as I said. So the wanderers, endorsed by the Vedic scriptures, lived outside of the society, while those of the post-Vedic period, they were seeking to establish a parallel society. And this is the critical distinction I'm making with the Vedic wanderers and the Buddhist wanderers. And this is a point I'm taking from Romila Thapar in his formulations on early India. And so she doesn't, sorry, Ramila Thapar doesn't explicitly talk about Buddhism, but this is a distinction that I draw on from Ramila Thapar's formulations. So again, to cut the long story short, the Vedic monastics, they were traveling in the forests in solitariness, completely isolated. They were completely cut off from the society, as opposed to the Buddhist monk. They were traveling mostly, in most instances, in Sangha, and they were trying to reform the society, and they were trying to establish a parallel society. So this was the problem from the statist point of view. And when I say statist point of view, I refer to, again, the Vedic authoritarian state at that point of time. So if you are a solitary wanderer going out for spiritual quest and spending, let's say, 30 years in the forest, that's not a problem for the state. That's not a problem for the Hindu Vedic society. But if you are a Buddhist monastic, if you are under the Buddhist monastic tradition, traveling in a group, in a sangha, and trying to reform the society as it is, that becomes a problem for the state. So this is what I refer to as the friction. So I'll yeah, outside of the society, where those of the society were seeking to establish a parallel society, the ascetic, the Hindu ascetic, that is the sannyasi, uh, earned his right to renounce only after completion of certain social obligations. And this is the regulations that I just now referred. And if you look into the Hindu scriptures, it clearly laid down that you have to complete all the social obligations as laid down by the scriptures in order to be a sannyasi. So, as in, and these are obligations that are laid down in the Brahminical scriptures. So thereby complying with the Vedic dictates
Ajahn Samantha, voice lost.
Yes, it seems that we have lost the connection of Ajahn Avishek, right?
Okay, may have a problem.
Yeah, we'll try to establish the connection, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
I think we can wait for him for a moment.
Yeah, we can wait a few more minutes, right? Until he reconnected. Yeah, in the meantime, I would like to ask all our audience, all our respected participant to make their points, like even in the chat box. Yeah, okay, I think we are back. I think
I think I lost the internet. So I'll I'll close here. I'm very sorry that I'm already over time. But maybe in this context, the last concluding remark, maybe I'll read this one slightly longish passage from Uma Chakravarti's book. And this is relevant in the context of, if you recall, right at the onset, Ajahn Samantha had talked about the Buddhist concept of the Paribrajaka. So I'll conclude today's discussion with this one small passage which occurs in Uma Chakravarti's book on Buddhism, and I quote: "What distinguished the period in which Buddhism arose was the appearance of the Paribrajaka." Clearly, like what Ajahn Samantha mentioned, like Pali is Paribhajaka or Shramana. The Buddhist Shraman or the Paribrajak. So this characterized the emergence of Buddhism in India, and these were travelers who the Vedic state didn't particularly like, and this is what I refer to as, itinerancy or nomadology. This is exactly the kind of traveling that the state discouraged, and they actually feared this kind of traveling. So the characteristic feature of the Paribrajak was his state of homelessness. In Pali texts, they are described as moving from home to homelessness. The Shraman or the Paribrajak broke especially those rules, and this is very important. Shramana or Paribrajaka broke especially those rules that applied to the householder, Garhastha, in the Vedic thought. He shunned all tokens of Vedic culture, such as the sacred thread or the symbolic tuft of hair on the head, and he did not perform yaga, ritual. The renouncer and the householder were therefore opposed to each other, and they represented two parallel modes of existence in the heterodox tradition. The traditional antagonism of the two categories remained a constant feature of Indian society. The emergence of the phenomena of renunciation in opposition to the Brahminical tradition permeated the atmosphere of time to such an extent that the period as a whole has been characterized as the age of Shramanas and Brahmanas, like the antagonism you realize between the Shraman and the Brahman. Like these were two very uh, uh, radically opposite, radically different figures to begin with, although both the Shramana and the Brahmana undertook traveling and renunciation to a certain degree, but they illustrated two very different modes of traveling, two different illustrations of traveling. One is encouraged by the state, the other one is discouraged. So I'll stop here, and I'm so sorry that I'm slightly overboard, but I'm happy to discuss things with you. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Avishek, for your fascinating talk. So I think you have. I would respectfully invite all our participants to present their feedback or any questions or opinion, or even how you feel this, especially the Avishek's talk. Even you can type your question or your feedback on the chat box. Maybe we can take a few more minutes. If you have any questions or any ideas with regard to Professor Avishek's talk. Yes, I think perhaps they are finalizing, or they are thinking of their opinion. I would like to ask this, there are a couple of points that I think you have pointed out in your speech, like how we understand the concept of nomadology is a sort of is a broad concept that you have specified, in the sense that the nomads who are sort of dissident or radically deviating from the existing system. So maybe they may have some extreme political idea, or maybe they have a sort of the idea in their mind to radicalize or sort of to brainwash a group of community, or sort of some other people. So they are sort of as identified as nomads, I think, as I understand from your initial observation. So yeah, okay, I think we got a question from Ajahn Pagon.
Ajahn Pagon,
yeah. Can you?
I'm not sure if I got it right. It doesn't seem that Buddha used the nomadic approach, because he challenged the existing structure or categorization. He eventually set up his own system of categorization: monks, nuns, male, female, laity, and this is sufficient to make the state unhappy. My question is how to go so far as to assert a Buddhist nomadic approach. I mean, this is what I refer to as, Buddha, of course, never called himself a nomad. So this is my terminology, and I invoke Deleuze and Guattari to call these nomadic in the sense that it illustrates, as you said, like this is sufficient to make the state unhappy. So any kind of political resistance that makes the state unhappy is, drawing on Deleuze and Guattari, I refer to as nomadic. So of course, in that sense, the Buddha did have a nomadic approach. Number one, that's a fairly simple answer. But then if we look for support in the scriptural tradition, one of my very favorite texts, and I do talk about it in details in my book, the Samanya Fall Sutta, Buddhist Pali text. And this is precisely, it's a very thin, skinny text, very small text. And this is precisely where Buddha, it's an imaginary dialogue between the Buddha and Ajatasattu. And they actually talk about the value of wandering. So for those who are not familiar with the text, so of course this is a fictional text. There's no historical attestation to this, whether this happened or not. But then Ajatasattu comes to the Buddha and asks, like, why do you people wander? There's so much to do, as a king, I have so much. There's so much to do in the royal palaces and so much. So why do you leave all of this? So I have a spiritual quest. So can you teach me what do you get out of wandering? What is the value of wandering? Why do you wander? And then it's an imaginary dialogue between Ajatasattu and Buddha. And Ajatasattu says that I asked this question, and if I recall correctly, there were several other historical teachers at that parallel contemporaneous to Buddha, like Ajit Keshkambali and all of that. So there are 7 other teachers that Ajatasattu invokes and says, I have asked this to them as well, but they couldn't satisfy me. They do not have a correct answer, or I'm not happy with them. So can you explain? And then Buddha explains like why you need to wander. So I would probably go to the extent of saying, I mean, as I said in the beginning of the talk, I mean, do not take the nomad as a literal terminology. The nomad might not have got to do with the physical act of traveling. But then in the Buddha's case, if we have the the context of Samanyapal Sutta in mind, I would say Buddha is a classic example of who illustrated nomadology to a great extent. But of course, I'm aware that there are certain critics who make the argument, of course, that Buddha also was not radical enough. But that's a retroactive argument, I mean, in modern times, when you look back at certain people or certain school of thought, of course, that wouldn't appear to you as radical enough because we have moved along, right? So, I mean, if you look into Karl Marx, for example, now, scholars might say he was not radical enough. If you look into Mahatma Gandhi, for example, now, in retrospect, in hindsight, Gandhi might not appear to you radical enough. But I'm familiar with that kind of an argument. If you say that Buddha was not radical enough, I completely take that. But if you say Buddha was not radical, that's not a fair argument.
Yeah, like I think to add something to what Achan Pagon is asking, like, for example, I was trying to see that, like, when we see the Buddhist scriptures, for example, we see that the secondary literature being translated into English. So I don't see that Buddha is also, because Buddha has been translated, like has been known as a wanderer, but as a term, I don't see, like, I didn't find any evidence to see that Buddha is known as a nomad, in the sense that, because I bit reluctant to accept that because the term might give you some wrong implication in terms of as you pointed out in the beginning, it might sort of give in some reforms in the society, but in the extreme way, rather like going out of what the government or the existing state is expecting. So in that context, I think is rather Buddha is not called as a nomad, but Buddha has been several times has been known as a wanderer in search of in terms of serving people, in terms of giving benefits. And also, I would like to say that that you have pointed out the scriptural restriction in terms of how this the traveling being restricted in Buddhist, especially in the Vedic and the Buddhist texts. Like, as you know, we have this the situation even in Theravada countries, we call this rainy season, where the monks have been asked, or the bhikkhus have been asked to stay in isolation. So that is a sort of restriction or regulation has been adopted in early, like especially in the Vinaya text. We do see that monks have been encountering so many problems during the rainy season. So then, as a result of that, Buddha imposed this rule to be in isolation during, like, not to travel during the rainy season.
So this comes across in Samanyapal Sutta as well.
Yeah, okay. The thing that you have pointed out in the Samanyapal Sutta, I think it's sort of the main thing is to convey the idea that the portion or what is the portion of monk's life. Samanya is a monk, the life, how the monk's life portion. So that sort of the broad concept has been addressed there. Yeah.
No, but
Yeah.
I mean, speaking of the term nomad, like, I mean, as I said, that this is my terminology, and if you do not like it, you call the Buddha something else. So, I mean, I think here in the context of the idea is important, not the term. So if you do not like the term nomad, you might call him with your favorite term. I mean, that doesn't really matter as long as we all realize and acknowledge that the Buddhist monks, of course, Buddha himself illustrated a kind of a political subjectivity, which I think all of us are agreeing that it's a kind of a radical subjectivity that the Buddha illustrated. So if we are agreeing with that, I think then, I mean, it doesn't really matter what terminology you ascribe to him. So that's one thing. And also the other thing is, like, in the discussion, maybe it didn't come across very clearly. Like my concern is not so much with the Buddha as such, but I'm more concerned with the Buddhist monastic tradition as it emerged in the Vedic times. So I'm talking about a particular historical moment in the Indic or the Vedic thought. It's a particular historic moment, and if you recall the last couple of sets of quotes that I read out from, one from Ramila Thapar and the other from Uma Chakrabarti, I think they were also making this distinction between these, the political rivalry between the two sets of wanderings. So this has, if you may want to think that way, this might not have got to do much with the historical figure of the Buddha as such, as in the person Buddha, but more to do with a certain kind of, school and a collective existence that was emerging at that historical point of time in India, and which went against the Vedic sensibility. So I'm more interested in that kind of stuff. And of course, okay. I think it is important to realize that, I mean, the kind of collective, I mean, that's again a very, I do not know if that is an acceptable terminology. If I'm referring to, for lack of a better word, let me call this a collective. So these collective actually emerged much after the life and times of Buddha. So Buddha had by then expired. So when these the Buddhism as an emergent religion becoming a concern for the Hindu state, this is much after the life of the Buddha. That's what I'm saying. So I'm not very, I'm not, in calling the Buddha a nomad, I'm not trying to, ascribe nomadology upon the person Buddha as such. I'm more interested in looking as a collective, a certain kind of sensibility. And this sensibility of the Buddhist monastic order, they drew on the principal tenets of the Buddha. That is my point. Do you have in mind an idea that Buddhism loses its nomadic or resistant spirit now? I'm not very sure, and maybe I'm not the, maybe Ajahn Samantha is the right person to answer this, because I'm not a scholar of the Buddhist tradition. So I'm not very familiar with the contemporary or modern, like how Buddhism evolved in modern times. Like I haven't kept track of it. Like I, honestly speaking, yeah, I mean, but having said that, like my general answer would be, whether you are Buddhist or not, it is very difficult to be nomadic in today's world, given the capitalist setup and all of that. And that is something that I argue in my book. For example, imagine if I were a Buddhist and I wanted to travel the nomadic way. It's just not possible. If I wanted to come to the US the nomadic way, I would be in prison, right? So it's just not possible. It's an obsolete, redundant thing to begin with. Of course, there are people who illustrate nomadic spirits and nomadic subjectivities, but if these are Buddhist monks, I honestly do not know.
Yes. Does anybody have any questions or any idea? Because I think we have some couple of more minutes.
May I say something, Samantha?
Yes, I can. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Very fascinating talk. I was thinking it might be interesting to look at the so-called early medieval period as well. Like, of course, it's hard to define it, but after the fall of the Gupta Empire and before the Sultanate of Delhi, those few centuries where you get an expansion of texts and, of course, the religious traditions too. And in a book on the formation of esoteric Buddhism, Vajrayana, Ronald Davidson was talking about the Siddha movement.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that. Okay.
And they might be more like itinerant figures, Buddhist sages. And there you get the countercultural component, the antinomian component, going against the rules. And it's pretty strong. And there are some continuities with what, maybe even contemporary groups, especially in Bengal, that area, who keep the tradition alive. So he was writing about the Siddhas, and he mentioned, it described it as a movement. And
go ahead.
So that might be interesting. And also with respect to legislating mobilities, of course there are Dharma Shastra and all, but in this period I'm talking about, we also have copper plates and inscriptions, epigraphical evidence in very large number. And you get also the legislative aspect, like for instance, royal courts inviting Brahmin families to move to other areas in the countryside, and in the copper plates they mention where they are from. A family from Gujarat, and they move sometimes very far from their homeland.
This is precisely the demographic technique that I'm talking about.
It's
got to do with managing populations and space. Yeah, but could you please repeat the name of the book? I'm not familiar with that.
Ronald Davidson, Indian Esoteric Buddhism, A Social History of the Tantric Movement.
Social history of the Tantric Movement. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing that up. And I think it's very important what you brought up, because I think this has also, I really look forward to consulting the book. And I think this has also got to do with how the figures that have passingly referred to as the Bhakti and Sufi, they drew their, intellectual stimuli from. So this was an early medieval, again, like from the early medieval, these people like the Bhakta and Sufi sense would branch out from the Islamic and Hindu tradition, and they would, certain advocate for certain reformation from within Hinduism and Islam. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yes. Any other questions or any feedback from our audience? Yes. Yeah, like when they are still trying to give you their opinion, I just want to know this kind of sort of conversion. For example, now the Southeast Asian region, because of this Emperor Asoka's Dhamma propagation, the idea that what he did, sort of converting the people of that, even in Thailand and Burma and this entire what do you call this Swarnabhum, the people have been converted like into Buddhism. So do you think it's a sort of is a part of what kind of how do you like how do you think how do you fit that in terms of nomadic, like when you say, is it a sort of religious nomadicism or whatever? I don't have word to describe that.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I see more that as a statist propaganda rather than, you know, I mean, that's exactly what nomadism is against. So I think that is more of a kind of a statist political agenda to convert people and because in medieval times, in the pre-modern times, let's say, state and religion were often equated. Like your people would have the religion of the state. So the religion of the state were ascribed to the religion of the state. So until the French Revolution, to be very precise in history, like you didn't have a concept of, you know, religion being disassociated from the state. So I think that what you refer to as the conversion programs and all of that, that was very much a part of the statist propaganda, which is again odds with the principles of nomadism.
Okay, does anybody have any idea or any questions? I think it seems it seems we don't have any
more questions.
Yeah, more. Okay, then shall we conclude?
Yes, maybe.
Okay, now, I would like to thank our distinguished speaker, Assistant Professor Avishek, for being our speaker today. And also I am thankful to our staff, mainly all the Achans who did a wonderful job in organizing this series of seminar, series of talks. And I think he's an asset because he has contributed a lot in terms of like having these academic classes, 3 academic classes. So I think I really appreciate all the hard work done by our Achan Piyanath and all these all the Achans, and also Achan Pagon, who has been instructing throughout the course of the work. And also I would like to thank all our participants, including our Achan Francisco, who has been a regular participant, and also other participants. I do see lots of them here. Okay, then we can conclude today's very precious talk given by
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure, and yeah.
And then we hope to see you in the future, just like this kind of seminar or academic series or academic talks series, right? Okay, then does anybody have anything to say before we conclude? Okay. Then we wish you all the best to Achan Avishek for being our guest today, guest speaker.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so
we'll
much.
see you later.
Yeah, in a couple of days. Yeah.
Okay.